Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second Singapore Maritime Lecture. While we await the arrival of today's speaker, Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, Mr. Efthymios Mitropoulos, we would like to invite you to please take your seats. Before we begin, may I request for all mobile phones and pagers to be turned off or switched to silent mode. During the dialogue session, should you have a question for the Secretary General, please step forward to the nearest microphone. Await acknowledgement by the dialogue chairperson before asking your question. Kindly identify yourself and organization before posing your question. At the end of the event, may we request that you kindly remain at your seat while the Secretary General makes his way to the foyer. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome for our distinguished speaker for today, the Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, His Excellency Mr. Efthymios Mitropoulos. Mr. Efthymios Mitropoulos, Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the Singapore Maritime Lecture. We are indeed privileged to have the Secretary General deliver the second Maritime Lecture. Here with us today is also Ambassador Mary Sid Cheng, who will chair this afternoon's session. Ambassador Cheng is no stranger to the maritime community. Prior to her current appointment as Singapore's Ambassador to the Republic of Panama and Cuba, and Senior Specialist Advisor in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Cheng was Director of MPA's Policy Division, where she oversaw international maritime affairs and port industry development and regulation. As MPA's Policy Director, she also regularly led the Singapore delegation at IMO meetings in London. From 1973 to 1997, Ambassador Cheng was a career Foreign Service officer who served in Singapore's Canberra, London, and Brussels missions. She also held senior appointments in MFA's headquarters. May I now invite Ambassador Cheng on stage to deliver the opening remarks and introduce our distinguished speaker for this afternoon. Ambassador Cheng, please.
Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a good afternoon to you. It's a great turnout today, and I think it attests to the fact that we've got an illustrious speaker who would be speaking on a very interesting topic. It is also an added pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, as he is someone I've grown very fond of after working with him for many years at IMO meetings. Ladies and gentlemen, the Singapore Maritime Lecture is the blue ribbon event of the Singapore Maritime Week. It aims to bring together industry leaders and policymakers to discuss issues of concern to the global maritime community. Launched in 2007, the inaugural Singapore Maritime Lecture was delivered by the Singapore's Minister Mentor, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. This year, we have the honor to have the Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, His Excellency Mr. Efthymios Mitropoulos, to deliver the second Maritime Lecture. Some words about the IMO. The IMO was formed in 1948 to regulate international shipping and now has a membership of 168 member states. It is regarded as one of the best-run UN organizations, and in its 60 years of existence, it has scored many achievements, among them the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, and the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, MARPOL, and its various protocols. After 9/11, it proved all pundits wrong by swiftly putting in place the International Port and Security Code as part of SOLAS, and these key regimes have successfully governed international shipping today, contributing to safe, secure, and efficient shipping on clean oceans. Now the world attention is fixed on climate change. The threat posed by climate change and global warming is now universally accepted as immediate and real. As a responsible stakeholder, the maritime industry has to play its role too. This is not without its challenges. First, shipping is already the most efficient form of transport based on carbon emissions per ton kilometer. It accounts for the transport of more than 90% of global trade. The challenge is how shipping can become an even cleaner mode of transport, even as it has to deal with the rise in international trade and transportation. Second, the shipping industry is inherently international in nature. The challenge is how measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from shipping can be practical and effective, yet preserving important principles enshrined in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Third is how to ensure that the right measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from ships and formulated by the right experts. The industry will agree that the UN body that regulates shipping, the IMO, is the right body with the right expertise to formulate the way forward. Just last week at the IMO, at the 58th session of the Marine Environment Protection Committee, they met to address these challenges. It is hence very timely that we have the IMO Secretary General here to speak to us on this very critical issue. Mr. Mitropoulos will be sharing with us his views on the issue of climate change and international shipping, in particular the role of the IMO in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from ships. The Secretary General will speak for about 20 minutes, after which there will be plenty of time for a Q&A session, which I expect will be extremely stimulating. But before we hear from him, allow me to say a few words about our speaker. Admiral Mitropoulos has had a long and illustrious maritime career. After graduating from the Hellenic Coast Guard Academy in 1964 with flying colors, he served in various positions with the Hellenic Coast Guard and the Greek Maritime Administration. Between 1977 and 79, he had the enviable job of Harbour Master in Corfu. Admiral Mitropoulos had been involved in the work of IMO since 1966 as a member of and leader of the Greek delegations to IMO meetings. But his passion to contribute forced him to leave the wonderful atmosphere of Corfu in 1979 to move to the IMO, where he started off as implementation officer in the Maritime Safety Division. Of course, he rose quickly through the ranks, becoming director of the Marine Safety Division in 1992 and was appointed Assistant Secretary General in May 2000. 3 years later, in November 2003, Mr. Mitropoulos was elected as the Secretary General of the IMO. He has been reconfirmed for his second four-year term as Secretary General by the IMO Assembly in 2007. He's had a long 30 years career in the IMO, half the number of years that the organization has been in existence. so he has a Wikipedia in his head on the IMO. On a more personal note, I would like to give a flavor of the Secretary General as the quintessential family man. He's extremely sweet and considerate to his lovely wife Chantal, who is here with him today. I'm sure he will be pleased if we acknowledge her presence. Always important to remember the woman behind the man. Mr. Metropolis told me about their love story once on the sidelines of the IMO meeting. It was a very romantic story of how two ships, metaphorically speaking, almost pass each other in the night. But luckily, there was a fateful collision with a happy result. The Secretary General is also an extremely proud father of two brilliant children. Elias graduated from Oxford University and is now working with Rothschild. Athena is in the third year of Oxford University too. I think the moral of the story here is that if you want to find a good work-life balance, you might want to consider a job at the IMO. But let me conclude by giving one open secret about how you can get on the good side of the Secretary General. He's a passionate supporter of Manchester United. And very strange things happen at the IMO meeting. They start with announcement of football results. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker, an admiral, a gentleman, and a Manchester United fan, Mr. Secretary General.
Thank you, Mary. I couldn't dream of a better introduction in all respects of my life, private and professional. Thank you for your kind words about IMO, and thank you very much for the excellent introduction in the theme that I have been asked to speak about to you today. Permanent Secretary, Chairman and Chief Executive of the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore, Excellencies, Secretaries General, heads of international organizations, distinguished guests, media representatives, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real pleasure for me to come back to Singapore, and I want to thank the Maritime and Port Authority for inviting me to deliver the second Singapore Maritime Lecture on the occasion of this year's Maritime Week, organized and celebrated with the renowned Singapore efficiency and high sense of hospitality. Coming to Singapore not only gives us an excellent opportunity to engage in meaningful discussions on issues of interest to the industry we serve, it also allows us to admire and pay tribute to the country's great achievements in all respects. This very morning, I was trying to articulate in my mind the best way of expressing what I feel about Singapore, having come to this country so many times. In fact, I have come to Singapore more times than I've been to any other IMO member state. But let's keep it secret among ourselves, otherwise those of the 168 members of IMO that I have not visited will not be happy to find out this preferential, discriminatory treatment of Singapore. So I've come up with the epigrammatic words that, with the exception of the size of her territory, Singapore is great in all other respects. And I think this reflects the actual situation with respect to this great country. So we are privileged to be here, and I thank those who invited me, the organizers of the second Maritime Lecture, for asking me to be here with you today and speak on a subject of great importance as Mary alluded to. The greatness of Singapore. For Singapore, capitalizing on its strategic location, on its sophisticated port facilities and its modern shipyards, Singapore has developed into a premier international maritime center, where ships hub and essential ancillary services in shipping, commerce, and logistics flourish. With a vibrant maritime industry and excellent credentials in handling more than 20% of the world's transshipment trades, Singapore is in an envious position, from the fruits of which we all benefit, as she generously shares her know-how, her expertise, and her technological progress with the rest of the world, including making a valuable contribution to the work of IMO, for which I thank very much the representatives of the government of Singapore here present. Ladies and gentlemen, speaking to you as requested on climate change and international shipping, it is hard to imagine it today, but when the IMO Convention was adopted in 1948, and this year we are celebrating 60 years since the IMO Convention was adopted, we celebrated a number of milestones in the history of IMO. 60 years since the convention was adopted, 50 years since the convention came into force, the 100th session of the IMO Council, our return to our fully refurbished headquarters building. So when the IMO Convention was adopted in 1948, marine pollution was regarded as little more than a local problem. Some areas, notably those near ports and on major shipping routes, had experienced occasional oil pollution, but it was not generally thought of as a matter of international concern. By the 1950s, world trade was growing and oil pollution was increasing. When IMO became operational in 1959, the big boom in international oil trade was just around the corner. Within less than 2 decades, the world tanker fleet had increased tenfold in tonnage, and tankers themselves had grown in size by the same amount, with various words to express the size of the tankers, starting with supertankers, mammoth ships, VLCCs, and eventually ULCCs, to identify tankers, the ultra-large crude tankers that are capable of carrying more than 300,000 tons of oil. One result of all this was an alarming increase in pollution of the seas, especially oil pollution, which was caused not only by tanker accidents, but also as a consequence of routine shipping operations, such as the cleaning of cargo tanks. But it was the Torrey Canyon disaster of 1967 that focused the attention of the world on the real danger to the environment posed by the growth in tanker traffic. The Torrey Canyon ran aground while entering the English Channel. In those days, there was no separation of traffic at sea. Were it for IMO to have moved before that time, the tanker would not be allowed, in accordance with our traffic separation schemes and other routine measures, to sail into the English Channel close to the English coast. It will have to go close to the French coast. But this is what happened. At that time, there was no separation of traffic at sea. The Torrey Canyon, while entering the English Channel, ran aground and spilled her entire cargo of 120,000 tons of crude oil into the sea. This resulted in the biggest oil pollution incident ever recorded up to that time and raised serious questions about the adequacy of measures then in place to prevent oil pollution from ships. Enter IMO. The organization wasted no time as it embarked on a multifaceted, ambitious program of work, which gradually culminated successfully in the adoption in 1973 of the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, now known universally as MARPOL. 35 years later, albeit much expanded, amended, and updated, the MARPOL Convention remains the most important international treaty instrument covering the prevention of pollution by ships. Today, MARPOL has 6 separate annexes which address all forms of vessel source pollution. It sets out regulations dealing with pollution from ships by oil, by noxious liquid substances carried in bulk, by harmful substances carried by sea in packaged form,